If anybody has questions at any point, don't be afraid to stop me. I'll try to watch the chat. Otherwise, we can catch them at the end. So my name is Sara Bauder, and I work out of the Mitchell Regional Center for Extension. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about maintaining round bale value through proper storage. And I think this is something that's overlooked a lot of times. I also have a little info at the end of the presentation about hay sampling if you're buying or feeding, just knowing the proper and pretty simple method of sampling. So without further ado, I think I'll start in here. So round bales are one of our most common feedstuff storage methods in South Dakota, and we're one of the top producing forage states in the US. We kind of waver up in that top 5 depending on the year, but I believe in the 2017 census, don't quote me, I think we were 3rd in the nation or something like that. So we are quite high on the forage producing list, and forages are really easily overlooked. So I thought that I would do a little project. Tracy Erickson and I hold a forage field day. We used to hold it with Taylor Grusing, who was with Extension for a while as well, every other year at the Southeast Research Farm near Beersford. And this last one we had in 2019, we chose to do a bale storage demo, which got us kind of interested in bale storage and how overlooked it is, because we work so hard to put up these round bales. In this case, we're talking round bales. And a lot of times we put up great hay, but if it's not stored properly or as well as we have the means to store it, we're losing a lot of quality over time. So quality losses generally occur due to water entrance. That's the biggest thing. Excuse me. So when we talk about round bales, there's actually quite a few characteristics to them that limit storage losses. That's one of the reasons they became so popular. Mainly, obviously, their round shape. When they're laying, like you see in the picture, that round shape tends to shed water, especially if they're dense and well packed. Sometimes soft cord bales aren't as good for this, but I think most modern balers, you're going to put up a hardcore bale, or you have the option to, and most people appear to do that. Another major plus of a round bale is that outer thatch layer. So because of either the twine or the net wrapping, and net wrapping, generally speaking, is a little bit better on the storage side of things, but either way, when it's rolling in the baler and getting wrapped, we get that outer thatch layer pretty well pressed in there. And especially with grasses that have a wider blade, that really helps the bale to shed water. So those are all positive things you have going for you when you put up round bales in the first place versus other types of forage storage or ground hay. So the bale demo I talked about, basically what we did was we bought a load of hay in February of 2019, and it was delivered to the farm February 1st. And at that time, we core sampled the bales in lots, and we considered what we did was different pile formations that I'm going to show you. And we considered every pile a lot in this situation. On your farm, you would probably consider a lot to be a cutting. So your first cutting would likely be all one lot because that hay is going to be very similar. So we core sampled them per lot for quality analysis, and we weighed every bale. And then we stacked them in the formations we had picked. Intentionally, we tried to pick formations that were common to what you see in South Dakota and the surrounding area. We moisture probed them, weighed, and core sampled them again in July. So they were out there for a few months, and as you know, 2019 was really wet. So it was actually a very telling study, because on a normal year, we likely wouldn't have had that much moisture, but we would have seen the same types of losses, but not to the extreme that we saw them because of the moisture. So that snippet in time, there was actually 20 inches of rain from February 1st to July 31st. And because of that, we really saw very obviously the differences in which pile was better than another, which was kind of nice for this demonstration. So we did moisture probe, and that's what you can see in the picture here. That's John Wolthusen, an extension employee, and he is probing the side of the bale. We actually used the probe. Every bale that we moisture tested, we had to put it in 50 times. So it's a pretty lengthy process, but it does give you a lot of information. So we did that at the end to see where the moisture was in the bale. And I have a note here, the week previous to all this sampling in July, on July 25th, it was somewhat dry. So we were able to measure what that bale kind of stored over time, versus if it had just rained, it may have shown a lot wetter than, you know, the bale would have been the next day or two. So here are the formations we chose. We had a couple bales that we placed indoor in a hoop barn that had a dirt floor. So it did have a dirt floor, but they were indoor the entire trial. Those were just kind of our control to show you how well the hay could have stored had we had it under roof. Then we had a single bale outdoor, just to show if the bale has no air restriction and it's outside, what it would do. Then in the top middle here, we had rows of bales with space in between the rows running north to south. On the bottom middle, we potted 4 bales basically tightly together. And what that did was show us if you didn't leave space between bales or between rows. The top right-hand corner is what I'd call the mushroom or the soup can stack. You typically see this for windbreaks and that type of thing. And then the bottom right, obviously, is the pyramid formation. And this was, let's see, I believe this was 11 bales, 6, 4, yeah. That was an 11 bale pyramid, and sometimes you'll see 12 or different types of pyramids, but that's just what worked with the load of hay we had to show how the water sheds from the top bales to the bottom. So here's some pictures of the formations. You can see that this hay, when it arrived, the net wrap was not as good as we had hoped. So that was one thing that wasn't the best. They didn't survive, apparently, the handling and travel as well as we'd hoped. And on top of it, because we weighed and cored every bale, of course, they were handled a little more than normal. But they were fine. I just, being transparent here, that the net wrap was not as tight and as good on every bale as we'd hoped to have. But in general, you know, you see hay like this, it gets handled. If it gets handled quite a bit, this is what happens. So when they were first stacked, this is what they looked like. And I'm gonna kind of go through the results of each pile here, and then I'll summarize them for you. So the indoor bales, like I said, they were in a hoop building, but it did have a dirt floor. So they wicked up some moisture from that floor, but they were overall 98%, so most of the bale tested less than 20% moisture. And when we're talking about round bales, ideally we want them under 18 to 20% moisture if we can help it. You'll see a lot of sources say small squares should be 18 to 20%, and anything larger should be about 3 to 5% less than that. So under 20% is good. And we did, even if you do store, just a tip here, bales inside, you really still need to monitor them for heating and wicking. Because if they're wicking up moisture, they could be getting wet and heating. And that's where you hear of bale fires or building fires where there's bales inside. And a lot of times it's maybe not from wicking, it's from putting up hay that wasn't dry enough and then stacking it tightly. And then, of course, the heating of the bale can cause the spontaneous combustion in the fire. So indoor or covered piles is obviously the best, but realistically, most producers in South Dakota don't have the space or the buildings for that, or they're not going to invest in the tarp. And keeping the tarp on can be difficult if you're not wrapping individual bales. So we just wanted to show this as a control. They stayed pretty dry. And here's the moisture maps that we created from the moisture probing. So we probed one of those bales that was inside, and the redder or oranger it is, the drier it is, and the bluer it is, the wetter it is. So you can essentially see that the core of the bale here is quite dry, and the bottom of the bale did wake up a little bit of moisture, but 98% of the bale was under 20% moisture, which is really good. So the single outdoor bales, we had 2 that we just sat outside with nothing around them, and we sampled the one that was facing north-south. So it was designed similar to, like I said, to bales that would have gaps. They maybe are in a row, but there's gaps between the bales and gaps between the rows, so there's just no air restriction. And there was about 15% of the area of the bale we sampled was greater than 22% moisture. So a small portion of this bale was a little wetter than we'd like to see it, but overall, still pretty good because it had that air movement. So here is the moisture map. You can see it's definitely wetter than those that were indoor, but it's wicking up moisture from the bottom. And then if you look at the top, the directions are a little wonky, but it's just because of the way we had to sample the bale from the north face. And I intentionally did that so it would be the wettest face so we could see the differences. So east is actually to your left in this case. But you can see the east side is a little wetter than the west. Could be due to the sun and that type of thing, being cooler in the morning maybe. But overall, not bad when we have our bales where there's minimal air restriction. So the next pile we had bales. I believe we had 6 we did this with. We rode them and pushed them together. So there was space between the rows, but there was not space between the flat face of the bale, as you can see in this picture. So we had some storage losses because water wanted to move. Because it was such a wet year, the water wanted to move between the bales, and they were butted together closely, so they didn't dry out very quickly. So about 66% of the bales were greater than 22% moisture. That's over half of the bale. So that's not great. There is not a consensus on this. You will find, and I'll go over it at the end, a consensus on best practice, best management practices. And when we talk about storing bales, one of them is to be sure to leave space between rows, but there isn't a consensus on whether we should leave space between each bale face. So in this case, it was not a positive because it was so wet, the water got trapped in. But if we leave space between them, snowpack can cause a similar problem in the winter. So if there's space between them, you might get snowpack issues. If there's no space, the rain doesn't want to dry out. So there's really not a you should do it this way when we talk about space between the flat faces of the bale. And it depends on the state and the person and, you know, personal preference typically. So long story short, these bales got wet in between the flat faces and it did cause quite a bit of damage. You can see here, the east side was wetter, and what's red there is the bale that we probed. So we pulled the bale out of the middle of the pile and probed the north side of it. So you can see that there was some dryness in the middle, but over half the bale was quite wet. So our next one is road bales. Again, they're butted together on the flat face, but these were also butted together on the round side. So it's like a pod of 4. And it was to emulate if you had all of your rows stuck together from both directions. So water tends to run down into the gutter, we call it, between the touching bales, which would be the space between the round sides. You know, it just forms a nice V-shaped gutter there, and sunlight really can't get in there. So more than 20% of the bale was greater than 30% moisture, and 30% moisture is quite wet for a hay bale. That is not ideal storage. So when you look at the moisture map here, excuse me, give you a second to look. If you look at the top of the page, the bales that we probed are in red, and we probed again the north side. So you can see that there was definitely moisture, and these 2 bales, just like you're seeing in the picture, were butted together. You're looking at them from the north. So where they're touching, there was a lot of moisture, okay, in that what we call gutter area. And then again on the east side of that bale on your left, there was quite a bit of moisture there too. So definitely some issues. This is why we suggest leaving space between the rows of the bales. Next one is the mushroom stack. This one is surprisingly popular in South Dakota, and I can't say I totally understand why, because it really doesn't lead to well-conserved hay at all. People like to do it for windbreaks and things like that, but beyond serving its purpose as a windbreak, it's really just not an effective way to store a round bale at all. You can see here the top bale was open to airflow, so the top bale actually does okay. 90% of it, so most of the bale was less than that 22% moisture. So most of that bale was somewhat dry, and you'll see in the map on the next sheet where the moisture was in the bale, mostly at the bottom. If you look at the bottom bale though, moisture from that top, because of the way it's sitting, is going to shed into the bottom, logically. And 45%, so about half of the bottom bale, was greater than 35% moisture, and anything over 25% moisture in a hay bale is not good. So 35% is extraordinarily wet. It had extensive spoilage. You could just walk up to that bottom bale and grab the thatch and mold would just fly off of it before we ever took the net wrap off. So it definitely absorbed basically all the water that ran off the top bale. And here's looking at them on end. So We took that bottom bale and just tipped it over and probed the end of it, and you can see how wet it was. Basically, the entire bale was spoiled. You'd have to get all the way down to the hard core in the middle to get anything worthwhile. And I was there. I mean, we saw it. It was quite moldy. The top bale does okay, but in this case, you're really wasting that bottom bale. And then lastly, we had a pyramid stack. This had, like I said, 11 bales, and this is what it looked like when we started. But stacking results in a lot of water infiltration through piles. So your lower bales, they don't get air movement or sun exposure on the sides, and they've got great gutters for the water to fall into. So in this case, over 35% was greater than 30% moisture in 2 of the bottom bales that we probed in this pile. So basically, our bottom bales were in pretty rough shape. The lower bales also lost their integrity and squatted, and I'll show you that picture in a minute. And once they lose their shape and integrity, that causes even more damage. Obviously, water damage causes that in the first place, but as they squat more, they tend to get looser, and then even more water can enter the bale. So here's what the moisture probing looked like, and we actually just climbed the pile. This one was more fun. But you can see that, I think I actually have I apologize, my directions are wrong. You're looking at this from the north. This is the north side of the pile, so the S and the N up there in the corner are incorrect, and I just noticed that. But essentially, these bales, the top one looked good, a lot like the mushroom stack. It's getting all the air. But once we go down, they just get wetter and wetter and wetter. And it's these bottom 2 on the left that were the wettest. And I'll show you here. This is what it looked like from February to July. And I didn't do anything to it, I promise. It just squatted that bad. So to me, that looks like hay that sat out somewhere for 3 years, but that was just a few months with an extensive amount of rain. But this is why piles that sit out for extended periods of time on normal years with not crazy amounts of rain do have issues. So just thought that was interesting to show, because there is a lot of stacking that goes on in different parts of the state. So overall, some best management practices to think about. Obviously, the #1 thing is to protect your bales from the elements using tarps or buildings. There's now a lot of wrapping options like you see in the picture, or B-wrap is something that John Deere has come out. It's a breathable film. I don't know the cost effectiveness of that, but that's just an option that's there that I know people have tried. But again, this isn't always realistic. Coming from an agronomist standpoint, who, I also come from a farm and we raise beef cattle, and the cost of wrapping our feed for feedlot calves is just, not always there. So we go the next best step and we store them outside the best way we can. So here is bales stored outdoors, things to think about. So #1, avoid shaded areas. If you have to be near a tree belt, try to get as far away as you can, just because those trees are going to shade the bales. And as you saw in a lot of the moisture maps, the east side of the bale, that morning sun tends to not dry it as well all the time. So if you can try to make sure they're getting sun all day long from east to west, that's the best you can do. And then place bales in rows oriented north to south. Reason being, again, sun comes up in the east, sets in the west, it's hitting both round sides of the bale. And leave about 3 to 4 feet between the rows. So a lot of research behind this. This is just a demonstration we did, I should clarify. Technically, it's not a replicated research project, but there have been many replicated research projects done on things similar to this, and that's where this data comes from. Our demonstration just backed up most of the research data. So 3 to 4 feet between rows, basically that helps sunlight dry the bales the best we can after a rain, lets the sun in there a little bit better, and then you can either butt the bales together like I talked about a few slides back, or you can leave them a foot or about 18 inches apart. And like I mentioned, if you butt them together, you'll avoid snowpack, but if you leave them apart, you'll avoid snowpack, but the rain gets in there and can't always get out and dried. But if you leave them apart, you might get a lot of snowpack in the winter. However, the rain would dry better in the summer. So it's kind of a catch-22, and there's no consensus on that. It's kind of a personal preference. And then if you can, use a slight south-facing slope to drain the water. That gets you a little more sun because it's south-facing. And use a well-drained soil surface if you can. You know, obviously a mud hole is not good, and I think that's pretty common sense. But people will even say a rock bed is good. But if you're grinding hay or you're feeding a lot of hay, you of course don't want small rocks or pea rock or whatever sticking to your bales. So use your best judgment there. There's a lot of research on net wrap versus twine, and honestly, all in all, net wrap helps hold the shape and the good leaf thatch better than twine. I think that's pretty well researched, but there is, again, there's a cost factor and a personal preference, and whether you are able to get the net wrap off to feed in the wintertime especially can be difficult for people, but it's much better when we talk about hay preservation than twine. And if you have to make a stack, we really advise you to cover them. If the couple slides back didn't convince you, I don't know what does, but I was really surprised at how badly those bales in that stack squatted. And I apologize if you can hear the thunder that my dog is trying to attack outside. So table 2, this is just a little bit of information. We do have a hay storage publication in the works as we speak. It should be printed in the next I'm hoping week or 2 and make it up on our extension website very soon. So all this information will be there in that publication, including this table, but I thought this was interesting. It comes from the University of Wisconsin from a study they did, and it's the average effect of hay storage on storage losses. So basically, if you're looking at different storage methods, they look at under roof all the way to uncovered on the ground. And I don't think I have to go through this line by line for you, but you can essentially see it goes from the lowest amount of loss to the highest potential range of loss. And I think some of it, like covered on ground versus uncovered on ground, is really interesting. You can still have quite a bit of loss. I'm assuming it's from moisture wicking from covered on the ground versus uncovered. So that's kind of intriguing, but covering definitely helps in most cases, especially if that hay was put up well in the first place. Keep in mind that if the hay is put up wetter than it should be, covering it or putting it in a building can be counterintuitive, of course, because it can heat. So that's also something to ponder. And there's a little bit on rock pads here too. And I just wanted to spend a couple minutes at the end here talking about bale sampling procedures. If you haven't ever sampled hay, it's honestly not too tough. If you're purchasing hay, we always suggest getting a sample so you know what the quality is. A lot of times we can look at a bale and say, oh, that hay looks like junk, or that hay looks really good, but you really don't know until you sample it. I've been proven wrong a lot of times when I've done forage analysis. So this is pretty simple. For starters, you do need a hay probe to do it well, and that can be a lot of things. I've seen people make them out of old golf clubs. You just need something hollow that can probe through the bale, but it's a whole lot easier to use a probe that fits on a drill or a hand probe like you see in the picture that actually screws into the bale. And you can borrow those from most of our extension centers or regional centers. I think all of them or most of them have probes you can go in and borrow. So that's number one. You need the probe, bucket, a Ziploc bag, and a marker to mark the bag. Use that probe to core. If you're doing a round bale, you want to do the round side because we want to get through as many layers of thatch as we can. Or if you do, a large square or a small square, you want to do the butt end of the bale because again, you want to get through all the layers of thatch. So we want to core at least 8 to 10 bales per lot. And again, a lot would be probably a cutting in most farmers' case. And then, or however you group your hay, I guess. It doesn't have to be per cutting, but that's just a typical way people group their hay. And then you need at least 20 cores total. So not only do you need 8 to 10 per lot, but that might mean you're taking at least 2 cores per bale that you sample in that lot, because you need at least 20 for volume and good mixing. So you make sure you're getting a nice uniform example of what's in that lot. So then you're going to combine your samples. You want to try not to pour any out. That's not that much to begin with. So combine them well, mix them, put them in your bag, and then label and submit to the lab. So it's not too difficult. And I just have a little video here I want to show you briefly. This is actually a video that 2 of our extension folks put together It's been a few years. Warren Rushi and Tracy Erickson put this together, and it's great. It explains forage sampling to a T. I'm just going to show you a quick snippet of it. It's about 10 minutes, but we'll just watch a minute or so. And I think I have to let it load here for a sec. Phil, are you able to hear that through my speakers?
I can't hear anything right now, no.
Okay. If you can't hear it, I'll just explain it and play what I want to show you.
Okay, yep, that'll work.
It's not too tough. I'm just going to show you a little bit of Warren Rushi sampling a bale. So it's really not terribly difficult. So he's just coring toward the center of the bale at the moment. And it's showing you how a hand probe would work. We do have probes that you can hook to a drill as well. And those are quite easy. If you're doing a lot of bales, I suggest those. And here's a round bale again. She's showing you how to sample into the curved side of the round bale. Yep, and if you can't hear her, she's saying to make sure you don't have net wrap or twine in your sample, because that can, of course, change the analysis. Here, she's just explaining a little bit more on the total. Essentially, what I want to show you there is it's really not too difficult to do the sampling, and it doesn't take too long. So if you're buying hay, I would for sure consider getting a sample first or taking that sample yourself. And we do have a list of forage labs on our website. You can look at that and find the one closest to you and ship the sample to them or bring it to them. It's not typically extremely expensive, especially if you just want relative feed value and that type of information. They'll do something called a dry NIR analysis. So just keep that in mind. Even if you put up your own hay and feed it, it's really nice to know what the feed value of that hay is. So that's just one way that you can do that. And it's, like I said, relatively inexpensive. So in summary here, keep your round bale storage techniques in mind as you put up hay so you can maintain the quality. And I just listed them again here. Try to avoid shade, place them in north-south running rows, and leave 3 to 4 feet between those rows if you can help it. Using a south-facing slope will help drain water and keep the sun on them on a well-drained surface, and don't stack, or if you have to, cover the stack if you can help it. And of course, again, when you're feeding or buying hay, consider using a quality analysis as a benchmark. We do have hay probes for checkout at our centers. I don't think anyone charges for them, at least in Mitchell. Ours is entirely free for you to use and bring back. Here's some acknowledgements for people that helped with the data I shared with you today. That project was more work than it sounds like, and we really appreciate everyone that helped out at the research farms. And we did this in partnership with Dr. Kevin Shinners out of the University of Wisconsin, who's really more of a hay storage expert than Tracy and I, so we really appreciated his work. And of course, my partner Tracy, who she did a lot of the work too. So her and I, she's our dairy field specialist, are trying to team up on some of these forage projects. This is my info. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Thanks for listening.